Was this change positive or negative for royal women? The answer depends on perspective and circumstances. From one viewpoint, the new system provided greater security and clearer expectations. Queens no longer had to navigate the deadly uncertainties of medieval politics where a single mistake could trigger civil war or dynastic collapse. The emergence of more formal court structures also created new opportunities for cultural patronage and artistic expression. Renaissance queens like Isabella d'Este and Catherine de Medici would use these opportunities to become some of history's most influential cultural figures, shaping art, literature, and intellectual life in ways that had lasting impact. But from another perspective, the transformation represented a significant loss of female political power. Medieval queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile had wielded authority that was real, immediate, and consequential. They made decisions that affected the lives of millions and shaped the political development of entire kingdoms. The new model of queenship was more ornamental and less substantive. While Renaissance and early modern queens could influence cultural trends and social customs, they rarely had the kind of direct political authority that their medieval predecessors had taken for granted. Perhaps most significantly, the change reflected broader shifts in European society toward more centralized, bureaucratic forms of government that had less room for the personal relationships and informal networks that had characterized medieval politics. This wasn't necessarily progress, it was simply change, with its own benefits and costs. While Western European queens were fighting for scraps of influence in male-dominated courts, Byzantine empresses were wielding absolute power in Constantinople. Unlike their Western counterparts, Byzantine empresses could rule in their own right, command armies, and execute rivals without needing male approval. This wasn't liberation. It was simply a different flavor of medieval ruthlessness. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Rome, had a more flexible approach to female power. Empresses weren't just wives and mothers. They were co-rulers, generals, and political masterminds. But this power came with equally dangerous responsibilities. Byzantine politics made Western European court intrigue look like a children's game. The purple-clad empresses of Constantinople understood that power was never given. It was taken and held through a combination of intelligence, brutality, and strategic alliances. They navigated a world where today's trusted advisor could be tomorrow's assassin, where religious disputes could trigger civil wars, and where the wrong decision could result in being blinded, exiled, or thrown to wild animals in the hippodrome. Take Empress Irene of Athens, who ruled the Byzantine Empire from 797 to 802. Irene's path to power was paved with the blood of her own family. When her husband, Emperor Leo IV, died in 780, she became regent for their 10-year-old son, Constantine VI. But Irene had no intention of stepping aside when Constantine came of age. For 17 years, she systematically undermined her son's authority. She encouraged his military failures, sabotaged his marriages, and turned the army against him. When Constantine finally tried to assert his independence, Irene struck with breathtaking cruelty. In 797, she had her own son arrested, blinded, and imprisoned. The blinding was so severe that Constantine died from his injuries, leaving Irene as sole ruler. This wasn't maternal instinct. This was calculated political murder. Irene understood that in Byzantine politics, sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed. She ruled for 5 more years, the first woman to hold the imperial title in her own right, before being overthrown in a palace coup. Even more ruthless was Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian I, who rose from actress and probable prostitute to become one of the most powerful women in history. Theodora's background in Constantinople's entertainment district gave her an education in human nature that proved invaluable in imperial politics. She knew how to read people, manipulate desires, and strike when enemies were vulnerable. During the Nika riots of 532, when half of Constantinople was in flames and Justinian was preparing to flee, Theodora delivered one of history's most famous speeches. "Purple makes a fine shroud." She convinced Justinian to stay and fight, personally directing the massacre that ended the rebellion. Over 30,000 people died in the Hippodrome, but Theodora's empire survived. Theodora didn't just influence policy, she shaped law. Her legislation improved the status of women, regulated prostitution, and expanded divorce rights. But she also maintained a network of spies and assassins that eliminated political threats before they could materialize. One historian described her as having a mind sharper than a blade and a heart harder than marble. But Byzantine female power came with unique contradictions. These empresses wielded authority that Western queens could only dream of, yet they operated within a system that was fundamentally unstable. Byzantine succession was never guaranteed. It depended on military support, popular approval, and the favor of the church. Unlike Western European kingdoms, where primogeniture provided some stability, the Byzantine Empire was essentially an elective monarchy where anyone with enough support could claim the purple. This meant empresses had to constantly watch for rivals, not just among the nobility, but among generals, religious leaders, and even their own families. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity. Byzantine empresses were expected to be models of Christian virtue while simultaneously ordering executions, manipulating church politics, and engaging in the kind of realpolitik that would make Machiavelli proud. They had to balance public piety with private ruthlessness, often walking a tightrope between salvation and damnation. Consider Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita, who was married 3 times and possibly murdered at least one husband. She ruled for nearly 50 years in the 11th century, often jointly with her sister Theodora. Zoe's reign was marked by extravagant spending, political instability, and a series of romantic scandals that kept Constantinople's gossips busy for decades. The legacy of these Byzantine empresses was complex and far-reaching. Their examples proved that women could wield absolute power effectively, but their methods often reinforced stereotypes about female rulers being more cruel and unpredictable than men. Western European chroniclers were both fascinated and horrified by Byzantine empresses. They represented everything that male-dominated Western societies feared about female power: intelligence without restraint, ambition without limits, and the willingness to destroy traditional hierarchies to achieve their goals. The Byzantine model influenced other cultures as well. Islamic rulers studied Byzantine court politics. Slavic kingdoms adopted similar approaches to female power, and even Viking society showed the influence of Eastern European political practices. But perhaps the most significant consequence was how these empresses changed the very definition of royal power. They demonstrated that effective rule required more than military prowess or divine right. It demanded political intelligence, cultural sophistication, and the ability to balance competing interests. While Byzantine empresses were mastering the besting events, politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, in Northern Europe, another breed of powerful women was emerging. The Viking Age produced queens and female rulers who combined the political sophistication of Byzantine empresses with the martial traditions of Germanic warrior culture. These women didn't just rule from palaces. They led from the front lines of battles. Their power measured not just in gold and land, but in ships and swords. Let's talk about Rosamund, Queen of the Lombards, whose story reads like a medieval Game of Thrones episode that even HBO would consider too dark. In 572 CE, Rosamund was forced to marry Alboin, the Lombard king who had killed her father Cunimund in battle. But Alboin wasn't content with just defeating his enemy. He turned Cunimund's skull into a drinking cup, because apparently medieval kings had a flair for the dramatically psychotic. For years, Rosamund endured this marriage, knowing that every royal feast meant watching her husband drink wine from her father's skull. Alboin would literally toast to his victories using her father's remains as a goblet. The psychological torture was deliberate and constant. This wasn't just conquest. It was sustained emotional warfare disguised as marriage. But Rosamund was playing a longer game. She began an affair with Helmichis, one of Alboin's most trusted warriors, and together they planned something that would shock even medieval standards of royal justice. In 572, during a feast where Alboin was particularly drunk and boastful about his skull cup, Rosamund struck. She poisoned the wine, the same wine that Alboin was drinking from her father's skull. The poetic justice was deliberate and brutal. As Alboin realized he was dying, Rosamund reportedly told him exactly what she had done and why. The cup made from her father's skull had become the instrument of his own death. But the story doesn't end there. After Alboin's death, Rosamund found herself in an impossible position. The Lombard nobles suspected her involvement and were planning revenge. So she did something even more shocking. She married Helmichis, and together they fled to the Byzantine Empire, seeking protection from Emperor Justin II. The Byzantines, however, had their own plans. They convinced Rosamund to poison Helmichis as well, promising to make her an imperial consort. But when Helmichis discovered the second poisoning plot, he forced Rosamund to drink from the same poisoned cup, killing them both. Rosamund's story became legendary across medieval Europe as an example of how far royal women would go for revenge. But it also revealed the impossible choices facing queens in warrior cultures: submit to humiliation or risk everything for justice. Her legacy influenced how later medieval queens thought about marriage, power, and the acceptable limits of royal authority. If Byzantine empresses were masters of palace intrigue, Viking queens were warriors who happened to wear crowns. The Norse world had a fundamentally different approach to female power. Women could own property, request divorces, and in some cases, lead military expeditions. This wasn't medieval feminism, but it was a culture that recognized practical female authority when it served the community's interests. Viking society was built around raiding, trading, and expansion. Success required every capable person to contribute, regardless of gender. While men typically handled the physical aspects of warfare, women often managed the economic and political infrastructure that made Viking expansion possible. They controlled trade networks, negotiated alliances, and sometimes led military campaigns when circumstances demanded it. Norse sagas, while often exaggerated, preserve stories of queens who were as feared as any male warrior. These weren't romantic fantasies. They reflected a society where female rulers had to be as ruthless and strategic as their male counterparts to survive in a world of constant warfare and political instability. If you think modern politics are brutal, let me introduce you to Fredegund of Neustria, who ruled from 584 to 597 and redefined royal ruthlessness for the medieval world. Fredegund didn't just eliminate political enemies. She turned murder into an art form that would have impressed even the most creative psychopaths. Fredegund started as a servant in the court of Chilperic I, king of Neustria. But she was beautiful, intelligent, and absolutely without moral restraints. When Chilperic's first wife Audivera became inconvenient, Fredegund convinced the king that Audivera was plotting against him. Audivera was murdered, and Fredegund became queen. But Fredegund's real masterpiece was her treatment of Chilperic's second wife, Galswintha. Instead of simply having her poisoned or stabbed, Fredegund orchestrated a psychological campaign that drove Galswintha to suicide. She spread rumors about Galswintha's supposed affairs, arranged for her to be publicly humiliated at court ceremonies, and gradually isolated her from all sources of support. When Galswintha finally hanged herself in despair, Fredegund expressed public grief while privately celebrating her victory. But the suicide triggered a blood feud with Galswintha's sister Brunhilde, Queen of Austrasia, that would dominate Frankish politics for decades. The war between Fredegund and Brunhilde was unprecedented in its personal viciousness. These weren't just political rivals. They were women who genuinely hated each other and used their royal authority to pursue vendettas that destroyed thousands of lives. Fredegund's methods were innovative and horrifying. She pioneered the use of political assassination as a regular tool of governance, employing networks of spies and killers who could eliminate enemies without leaving evidence. She also used sexual scandal as a weapon, spreading rumors about opponents, marital fidelity, and sexual preferences to undermine their political authority. But perhaps her most shocking innovation was the strategic use of torture and mutilation. Fredegund didn't just kill enemies. She displayed their suffering as a warning to others. She reportedly had one rival noble slowly flayed alive during a public ceremony, explaining to the crowd exactly why each piece of skin was being removed. Her treatment of children was particularly disturbing. When rival claimants to the throne became problematic, Fredegund would have their children kidnapped and then sent back to their parents piece by piece. She understood that psychological warfare could be more effective than military force in breaking enemy resistance. The most notorious incident involved her conflict with Protectatus, the Bishop of Rouen, who had criticized her treatment of political prisoners. Fredegund arranged for the bishop to be stabbed during Easter Mass, but not fatally. Instead, she had him kept alive just long enough to publicly confess to imaginary crimes before dying from his wounds. Even her relationship with her own family was marked by violence. When her stepson Clovis began showing signs of political ambition, Fredegund had him arrested on charges of witchcraft and then personally supervised his torture until he died. She reportedly used his death as an opportunity to eliminate several other potential rivals who had supported him. Fredegund's reign was so violent that it shocked even medieval standards of royal brutality. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find appropriate language to describe her actions, often resorting to comparisons with biblical villains or demonic possession. But what made Fredegund truly terrifying wasn't just her cruelty, it was her intelligence. She understood how to use fear as a political tool, how to manipulate religious beliefs for secular purposes, and how to maintain popular support while eliminating elite opposition. She was a master of propaganda who could present mass murder as righteous justice. Her conflict with Brunhilde eventually consumed both kingdoms and contributed to the collapse of Merovingian royal authority. When Fredegund died in 597, probably from natural causes, though poison was suspected, she left behind a kingdom that was financially exhausted and morally corrupted by decades of systematic violence. Fredegund's legacy influenced how later medieval queens thought about the acceptable limits of royal authority. Her example showed that women could exercise absolute power through violence and intimidation, but it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of rule based purely on fear. Her methods were effective in the short term, but they created lasting damage to Frankish political culture. It contributed to the eventual rise of the Carolingian dynasty. Queen Gunhild of Norway, who lived in the 10th century, embodied the complex nature of Viking female power. Gunhild was supposedly trained in magic in the Finnmark, giving her a reputation for supernatural abilities that she used to political advantage. Whether or not she actually practiced sorcery, she understood the power of fear and mystery in medieval politics. Gunhild's political career began when she married Eric Bloodaxe, one of the sons of Harald Fairhair. When Eric was forced into exile from Norway, Gunhild accompanied him to the Orkney Islands and later to York, where Eric became king. But Gunhild wasn't content to be a passive royal wife. She actively participated in political negotiations and reportedly had several of Eric's rivals assassinated through her network of agents. After Eric's death in 954, Gunhild returned to Norway with her sons, determined to reclaim their inheritance. For the next decade, she orchestrated a series of military campaigns and political maneuvers designed to place her sons on the Norwegian throne. She arranged marriages, brokered alliances with Danish kings, and allegedly used her reputation for witchcraft to intimidate enemies. The sagas describe Gunhild as the most beautiful of women and very intelligent, but also the most wicked and cruel. She supposedly had lovers assassinated when they became politically inconvenient and used sexual relationships as tools of espionage and control. Whether these stories are accurate or the product of medieval misogyny, they reflect the kind of ruthless pragmatism that Viking queens needed to survive. Even more remarkable was Queen Thyra of Denmark, who may have been the real power behind the Danish throne during the reign of her husband, Gorm the Old, in the early 10th century. Archaeological evidence suggests that Thyra was responsible for the construction of the Danevirke, a massive defensive wall that protected Denmark from German invasion. This wasn't just a military project. It was an engineering marvel that required coordinating thousands of workers and massive resources. The Jellingstones, Denmark's birth certificate, mention Thyra prominently, with one stone erected by her son Harald Bluetooth, declaring that King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and memory of Thyra, his mother. That Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The fact that Thyra is mentioned equally with Gorm suggests she wielded significant independent authority. These examples reveal a pattern in Pedant's Norse female power that differed significantly from both Byzantine and Western European models. Viking queens operated within a warrior culture that valued practical competence over theoretical authority. They couldn't rely solely on bloodline or marriage connections. They had to prove their worth through concrete achievements. This created a unique form of female leadership that combined traditional feminine roles with masculine responsibilities. Viking queens managed households that could include hundreds of people, oversaw complex trade relationships that spanned continents, and sometimes led military expeditions when their husbands were absent or dead. The religious dimension was also different. While Christian queens had to navigate church doctrine about female submission, Viking queens could draw on Norse religious traditions that included powerful female deities like Frigg and Freya. The concept of the vulva, or female seer, gave women a recognized role in religious and political life that had no equivalent in Christian societies. The impact of Viking female power extended far beyond Scandinavia. As Norse settlers established communities across Northern Europe, they brought their more flexible gender roles with them. This influenced the development of legal systems in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Scotland and Ireland. In Iceland, the medieval law code preserved women's rights to property ownership and divorce that were far more extensive than those found in most European societies. Women could serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, inherit land, and, in some cases, represent their families in disputes. The Norse model also influenced the development of queenship in other parts of Europe. The marriage of Norse princesses to rulers in France, England, and Russia brought new ideas about female political participation to traditionally male-dominated courts. But perhaps most significantly, Viking queens demonstrated that female power didn't have to be hidden or indirect. Unlike their counterparts in other cultures, who often ruled through influence and manipulation, Norse queens could exercise direct authority when circumstances warranted it. Yet even as Viking queens were carving out their own form of power in the North, the tide of medieval politics was turning. The rise of centralized monarchies and the increasing influence of the Christian Church were creating new constraints on female authority. The age of warrior queens was giving way to an era where royal women had to be more subtle, more manipulative, and often more deadly to achieve their goals. In France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, a new generation of queens was emerging who would master the art of ruling from the shadows. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the Plantagenet dynasty had created the most powerful empire in Western Europe, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But this vast realm was held together by a series of complex marriages, shifting alliances, and personal relationships that were as volatile as they were strategic. At the center of this political web were queens who understood that the price of power was eternal vigilance and occasional ruthlessness. The Angevin Empire, as historians call it, was always unstable. It depended on the personal loyalty of dozens of nobles who controlled their own armies and had their own ambitions. Kings were constantly traveling between territories, putting down rebellions, negotiating with rivals, and trying to maintain control over lands that spoke different languages and followed different customs. In this environment, queens couldn't be passive decorations. They had to serve as regents during their husbands' absences, negotiate with hostile nobles, manage complex financial networks, and sometimes make life or death decisions that would affect thousands of people. The stakes were enormous. A single mistake could trigger civil war, foreign invasion, or dynastic collapse. Let's be honest about what marriage meant in the Plantagenet world. These weren't romantic unions. They were hostile corporate takeovers disguised as wedding ceremonies. And the women involved understood this better than anyone. Take Berengaria of Navarre, Richard the Lionheart's queen. Their marriage in 1191 was purely strategic. Richard needed Navarre's support for his crusade, and Berengari's father needed an alliance with England. But here's where it gets interesting. Richard and Berengari spent exactly 0 time together after their wedding. Richard was too busy fighting in the Holy Land and later being imprisoned in Austria. Berengari spent years as a queen without a king, managing her own estates and essentially running a shadow government. But the real scandal was what everyone whispered about Richard's preferences. Medieval chroniclers delicately mentioned that Richard shared the bed of the King of France during their joint crusade. Whether this was political alliance or personal attraction, Berengari found herself married to a man who was more interested in military conquest than marital conquest. She adapted by becoming one of the most independent queens in medieval history, essentially running her own mini-kingdom while Richard played soldier. Then there's Constance of Brittany, whose story reads like a medieval thriller. Constance was married to Henry II's son, Geoffrey, but when Geoffrey died in a tournament accident in 1186, she became a widow with a young son who had a legitimate claim to the English throne. This made her incredibly dangerous to the Plantagenet succession plans. King John, Geoffrey's brother, solved this problem in typical Plantagenet fashion. He had Constance kidnapped and imprisoned. For 3 years, she was held in various English castles while John tried to force her to renounce her son's claims. Constance wasn't having any of it. She managed to escape, fled to France, and spent the rest of her life organizing rebellions against English rule in Brittany. The most chilling part: when Constance finally died in 1201, many suspected she had been poisoned on John's orders. Her son Arthur, who had the strongest claim to the English throne after Richard's death, mysteriously disappeared while in John's custody in 1203. Most historians believe John had the boy murdered, eliminating the threat to his own crown. This wasn't royal drama. This was systematic elimination of political rivals using marriage, kidnapping, and murder as tools of statecraft. And the women involved had to navigate this world, knowing that a single wrong move could mean death, imprisonment, or the murder of their children. But perhaps no Plantagenet queen story is more explosive than Eleanor of Aquitaine's attempt to destroy her own husband. In 1173, Eleanor did something almost unthinkable. She encouraged her sons to rebel against their father, Henry II. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Eleanor had been planning this for years. She was furious about Henry's affair with Rosamond Clifford, but more importantly, she disagreed with his policies regarding their sons' inheritances. Henry wanted to maintain centralized control, while Eleanor believed in giving their sons real power in their designated territories. The rebellion was a family affair from hell. Eleanor coordinated with her sons, Henry the young king, Richard, later the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, to simultaneously attack Henry II from multiple directions. She also arranged for support from Louis VII of France, her ex-husband, creating the ultimate awkward family reunion. The plan was sophisticated and brutal. While Henry II was dealing with rebellions in Normandy, Eleanor would take control of Aquitaine and declare independence. Meanwhile, her sons would seize their father's English strongholds and demand immediate recognition as independent rulers. What made this particularly scandalous was that Eleanor was essentially committing treason. Medieval queens who betrayed their husbands faced horrific punishments. Some were executed, others were imprisoned for life, and many simply disappeared. Eleanor knew the risks, but she calculated that her political value was too great for Henry to eliminate her entirely. The rebellion failed, but barely. Henry II's military skills and loyal supporters ultimately defeated the coalition, but it took 2 years of warfare and nearly bankrupted the kingdom. When Eleanor was finally captured in 1174, she was dressed as a man and trying to escape to France, a final act of defiance that became legendary. Henry's punishment was calculated humiliation. He imprisoned Eleanor for 16 years, not in a dungeon, but in comfortable confinement that allowed her to maintain her dignity while being completely powerless. It was psychological warfare disguised as mercy. Eleanor spent those years writing letters, maintaining correspondence with allies across Europe, and planning for the day when she would regain her freedom. And she did regain it when Henry died. In 1189, Eleanor immediately emerged from imprisonment to serve as regent for Richard, and later for John, wielding more power in her 70s than most kings managed in their prime. Her rebellion had failed, but her patience had succeeded. She had outlasted her husband and emerged as the real power behind the Plantagenet throne. The breaking point came during the reign of King John, Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest son. John had inherited a kingdom in crisis, having lost most of the French territories to Philip Augustus of France. His attempts to reclaim these lands had bankrupted England and alienated the nobility. By 1215, the barons were in open rebellion, demanding limits on royal power and guarantees of their traditional rights. But the real drama was playing out behind the scenes, involving John's queen, Isabella of Angoulême. Isabella had been betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan, a powerful French noble, when John abducted her and married her himself in 1200. This wasn't romance. It was a calculated political move designed to prevent the Lusignan family from consolidating power in western France. The abduction backfired spectacularly. Hugh de Lusignan appealed to Philip Augustus of France, giving the French king a legal pretext to seize John's French territories. The resulting war lasted for years and cost John most of his continental empire. Isabella found herself trapped in a marriage that had made her queen, but also made her kingdom poorer and weaker. Isabella's response was to create her own power base independent of her husband. She cultivated relationships with English nobles who were growing increasingly frustrated with John's failures. She managed her own estates, maintained correspondence with continental allies, and reportedly had several affairs with men who could be useful to her politically. when the barons finally forced John to sign Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. Isabella was there, not as a decorative witness, but as an active participant in the negotiations. She understood that the document wasn't just about limiting royal power. It was about creating a new political settlement that would determine the future of the English monarchy. The crisis deepened when John died suddenly in 1216, leaving Isabella as regent for their 9-year-old son, Henry III. This was the moment when Isabella's political skills were truly tested. She had to hold together a kingdom that was still in the middle of a civil war, with French armies occupying much of southern England and rebel barons controlling large parts of the country. Isabella's masterstroke was to ally herself with William Marshal, one of the most respected knights in England, and Hubert de Burgh, a brilliant administrator. Together, they formed a regency council that gradually restored royal authority, while making enough concessions to the rebels to prevent further warfare. But Isabella wasn't content to be a mere figurehead. She negotiated directly with rebel leaders, arranged marriages for noble daughters to secure loyalties, and used her own estates to fund military campaigns. She also maintained secret communications with her former betrothed, Hugh de Lusignan, laying the groundwork for a relationship that would later shock medieval Europe. Here's where Isabella's story becomes truly scandalous. In 1220, 4 years after becoming regent, Isabella made a decision that stunned medieval Europe. She abandoned her regency, left her young son Henry III, and returned to France to marry Hugh de Lusignan, the man she had originally been betrothed to 20 years earlier. This wasn't just romantic reunion. It was geopolitical earthquake. Isabella was still Queen Dowager of England, mother of the reigning king, and one of the most powerful women in Europe. By marrying Hugh, she was essentially defecting to the French side in the ongoing conflict between England and France. But the scandal went deeper. Isabella took her daughter Joan with her to France, effectively kidnapping a princess of England. She also retained control of her English estates, meaning she was collecting revenues from England while living in France and married to a French noble who was actively fighting against English interests. The English nobility was furious. Many accused Isabella of treason, arguing that she had abandoned her responsibilities as Queen Mother and Regent. Others suspected that she had been planning this move for years, using her position as regent to gather intelligence that she could share with French enemies. The truth was probably more complex. Isabella was genuinely attracted to Hugh. They had known each other since childhood, and their original betrothal had been broken against their will. But she was also a shrewd politician who understood that her position in England was becoming increasingly precarious as Henry III grew older and needed her less dogged by marrying Hugh. Isabella secured a powerful ally for herself and her children. Hugh was one of the most influential nobles in western France, with extensive lands and strong military forces. As his wife, Isabella could protect herself against any future attempts by English nobles to eliminate her influence. The marriage also gave Isabella the opportunity to play both sides in the Anglo-French conflict. She maintained her English titles and properties while also gaining access to French court politics. This made her incredibly valuable as a diplomatic intermediary, but also incredibly dangerous as a potential double agent. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Henry III spent much of his early reign trying to regain control of his mother's estates and influence. The English nobility became deeply suspicious of foreign-born queens, leading to increased restrictions on royal marriages. And the precedent of a queen dowager abandoning her adopted country for personal reasons would influence royal politics for centuries. Here's a story that medieval chroniclers tried desperately to suppress, but the evidence is too compelling to ignore. Marguerite of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy, wives of future French kings, were reportedly lovers whose relationship became one of the most explosive scandals of the 14th century. The Tour de Nesle affair of 1314 officially involved accusations that the two queens were having affairs with Norman knights. But contemporary letters and court records suggest something more complex and more shocking, that Marguerite and Blanche were primarily involved with each other, and their relationships with men were either political covers or attempts to produce heirs while maintaining their primary emotional bond. Both women were married to sons of Philip IV of France, Marguerite to Louis X and Blanche to Charles IV. Their marriages were political arrangements designed to secure Burgundian support for French policies. But the women had known each other since childhood and had maintained an intimate friendship that raised eyebrows even in a court accustomed to close female relationships. The scandal broke when Jacques Donnet and Gauthier Donnet, two Norman knights, were tortured into confessing adultery with the queens. But their confessions were suspiciously detailed and contradictory, suggesting they were covering for something else entirely. Several contemporary observers noted that the knights seemed more concerned with protecting the queens' reputations than saving their own lives. Marguerite and Blanche were imprisoned in separate fortresses, where they reportedly continued to communicate through coded letters and loyal servants. Their persistence in maintaining contact, despite enormous risks, suggests a relationship that went far beyond casual friendship or political alliance. What makes this story particularly significant is how it was handled by the French royal family. Instead of executing the queens for adultery, as would have been standard practice, Philip IV arranged for their marriages to be annulled on technical grounds. This unusual mercy suggests that the real scandal was something the royal family wanted to suppress, rather than publicize. Marguerite died in prison in 1315, possibly from poisoning, while Blanche survived until 1326. Neither woman ever spoke publicly about their relationship, but their story became legendary in French court circles as an example of love that transcended social expectations and political necessity. The affair contributed to the succession crisis that would eventually trigger the 100 Years' War, since the annulment of the royal marriages raised questions about the legitimacy of potential heirs. But more importantly, it revealed the complex emotional lives of medieval royal women who found ways to maintain authentic relationships despite the political constraints of their positions. But Isabella's story gets even darker. In 1244, nearly 25 years after her controversial remarriage, Isabella was accused of attempting to poison her own son, King Henry III of England. The plot allegedly involved a servant who had been sent to England with poisoned rings designed to kill Henry when he wore them. The assassination attempt was discovered when the servant confessed under torture, implicating Isabella and several French nobles in the conspiracy. Whether Isabella was actually guilty remains debated by historians. Some argue that the confession was extracted under torture and therefore unreliable. Others point out that Isabella had strong motives for wanting Henry dead. He had been trying to reclaim her English estates and reduce her influence in both English and French politics. What's not debated is the political impact of the accusations. Henry III used the poison plot as justification for seizing Isabella's remaining English properties and cutting off all communication with his mother. Isabella found herself effectively exiled from England and increasingly isolated in France. The scandal also damaged relationships between England and France, with both sides accusing the other of using assassination and poison as tools of diplomacy. It reinforced negative stereotypes about foreign queens and contributed to the growing belief that royal marriages should be arranged for political advantage rather than personal preference. Isabella died in 1246, just 2 years after the poison. The plot came to light. She was buried at Fontevraud Abbey alongside other members of the Plantagenet dynasty, But her tomb was deliberately placed away from the main royal burials, a final symbol of her complicated relationship with the family that had made her queen. The immediate reaction to Isabella's regency was mixed. Some praised her for providing stability during a crisis, while others questioned whether a foreign-born woman should wield such authority over English affairs. The church was particularly uncomfortable with Isabella's independence, viewing her as a dangerous example of female ambition unchecked by proper male authority. Isabella's political success during the Regency established important precedents for future queen mothers. She demonstrated that women could effectively serve as regents without triggering political chaos, paving the way for later queens like Eleanor of Provence and Margaret of Anjou to exercise similar authority. But Isabella's most controversial decision came in 1220, when she left England to marry Hugh de Lusignan, the man she had originally been betrothed to 20 years earlier. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a geopolitical earthquake. Isabella took her daughter Joan with her and effectively abandoned her regency responsibilities, leaving the English court scrambling to maintain the political arrangements she had carefully constructed. The marriage to Hugh was both a romantic reunion and a calculated political move. Isabella retained her dower lands in England, giving her significant income and influence in English politics, even while living in France. She also used her position as Hugh's wife to broker agreements between French and English nobles, creating a cross-channel network of relationships that served her interests. The consequences of Isabella's choices extended far beyond her lifetime. Her son Henry III never forgot that his mother had abandoned him for political advantage, leading to a complex relationship that influenced English royal politics for decades. Her daughter Joan, who grew up in France, became a key figure in Anglo-French diplomacy as the wife of Alexander II of Scotland. What emerges from studying the Plantagenet queens is a disturbing pattern of women who achieved power only to be destroyed by it. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the predictable result of a political system that demanded everything from royal women while offering them little protection when things went wrong. Consider Eleanor of Provence, who married Henry III in 1236 and immediately became one of the most hated queens in English history. Eleanor's crime wasn't scandal or adultery. It was bringing too many relatives to England and giving them important positions. The English nobility resented the influence of Eleanor's French and Savoyard relatives, leading to the baronial rebellion of the 1260s. The rebellion was brutal in its personal attacks on Eleanor. Rebel propaganda portrayed her as a foreign manipulator who controlled her weak husband and squandered English resources on foreign favorites. During one particularly vicious attack on London, rebels threatened to drown Eleanor in the Thames, forcing her to flee the city by boat while mobs hurled stones and insults at her dot. But Eleanor's real tragedy was that she was largely innocent of the charges against her. Her relatives were indeed given important positions, but this was standard medieval practice. Kings routinely used marriage alliances to bring talented administrators and military leaders into their governments. Eleanor was being blamed for her husband's political failures and the nobility's frustration with royal policies they couldn't directly challenge. Even more tragic was Margaret of Anjou, who became queen in 1445 and spent 30 years fighting to protect their husband Henry VI and their son Edward. Margaret's tragedy was that she was married to a king who suffered from severe mental illness and was completely unsuited for medieval kingship. When Henry VI had his first major mental breakdown in 1453, Margaret was forced to become the real ruler of England. She formed a regency council, negotiated with hostile nobles, and tried to maintain royal authority while her husband was catatonic. But her efforts to protect the monarchy led directly to the Wars of the Roses, the most devastating civil war in English history. Margaret's determination to secure her son's inheritance made her many enemies among the nobility, who saw her as a foreign-born manipulator who's prolonging a civil war for personal gain. When the Yorkist faction finally triumphed in 1471, Margaret's son Edward was killed in battle. Her husband was murdered in the Tower of London, and she was reduced to begging for financial support from her French relatives. The pattern repeated, with Anne Neville, who married Richard III and became queen just as his reign was collapsing. Anne had previously been married to Edward, Prince of Wales, Margaret of Anjou's son, making her a symbol of the reconciliation between the warring factions. But when Edward was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, Anne found herself a valuable political prize rather than a grieving widow. Richard III's decision to marry Anne was strategic. It gave him a claim to her inheritance and helped legitimize his usurpation of the throne from his nephews. But the marriage made Anne complicit in one of the most controversial actions in English history. When Richard's nephews, the princes in the Tower, disappeared, many suspected Anne knew what had happened to them. Anne died in 1485, just a few months before Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Some contemporaries suspected she was poisoned, either by Richard, who wanted to remarry, or by Henry Tudor's agents, who wanted to eliminate potential sources of opposition. Her death symbolized the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of a new era in English royal politics. The legacy of the Plantagenet queens was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, they demonstrated that women could exercise effective political authority during crisis situations. Eleanor of Aquitaine's regencies, Isabella of Angoulême's diplomatic networks, and Margaret of Anjou's military leadership proved that queens could be more than decorative consorts. But their experiences also reinforced negative stereotypes about female rule. The civil wars and political chaos that surrounded many Plantagenet queens convinced many medieval observers that women in power were inherently destabilizing. This perception would influence European attitudes toward female rule for centuries. Plantagenet queens also established important precedents for royal marriage politics. Their examples showed how marriage alliances could be used as tools of statecraft, but also how personal relationships between royal spouses could have devastating political consequences. Future European dynasties would study their successes and failures when arranging marriages for their own children. Perhaps most importantly, the Plantagenet queens demonstrated the fundamental contradiction at the heart of medieval queenship. They were expected to be both passive and active, submissive and authoritative, loyal to their birth families and their adopted kingdoms. These impossible expectations created the conditions for the tragedies that destroyed so many of them. Isabella's career revealed the fundamental contradictions of medieval queenship. She was expected to be loyal to her husband and kingdom, yet she was also expected to advance her family's interests and maintain her own political independence. These competing demands created impossible situations where queens had to choose between personal happiness, political advantage, and family loyalty. The Plantagenet queens also demonstrated how the expansion of royal power created new opportunities and constraints for royal women. As kingdoms became larger and more centralized, queens gained access to greater resources and authority, but they also became more visible targets for criticism and rebellion. Most importantly, the Plantagenet dynasty showed how personal relationships could have international consequences in medieval politics. Isabella's marriages affected the balance of power between England and France for generations. Her choices influenced trade relationships, military alliances, and cultural exchanges across Western Europe, while the Plantagenet queens were mastering the politics of Western Europe on the Iberian Peninsula. A different breed of royal women was emerging from the crucible of the Reconquista. These Spanish queens weren't just managing court politics. They were literally fighting for the survival of Christian civilization against Islamic forces that had controlled most of Spain for centuries. Urraca of Leon, who ruled from 1109 to 1126, was perhaps the most formidable of these warrior queens. When her father Alfonso VI died, Urraca inherited the kingdom of Leon and immediately found herself at the center of one of medieval Europe's most complex political situations. She was a queen regnant in her own right, not just a queen consort. And she wielded her authority with an iron fist that would have impressed even Eleanor of Aquitaine. But Urraca's reign was marked by constant warfare, both against Muslim forces and against her own nobles, who questioned her right to rule. The church was particularly hostile to the idea of a woman wielding supreme authority, leading to conflicts that sometimes erupted into open warfare between royal forces and church militias. Urraca's personal life was equally dramatic. She was married to Alfonso I of Aragon in what was supposed to be a strategic alliance to strengthen Christian resistance against Muslim armies. Instead, the marriage became a political disaster when Alfonso tried to claim authority over Leon as well. As Aragon, Urraca refused to submit to her husband's authority, leading to a civil war that lasted for years. The conflict between Urraca and Alfonso was both personal and political. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that Alfonso physically abused Urraca, while she responded by forming alliances with his enemies and sometimes leading armies against him personally. Their marriage was eventually annulled by the Pope, but not before it had nearly destroyed both kingdoms. What made Urraca remarkable wasn't just her military and political skills, but her understanding of propaganda and public relations. She regularly addressed her troops before battles, appeared at public ceremonies in full armor, and used religious symbolism to present herself as a divinely appointed defender of Christianity. She understood that being a successful female ruler required not just competence, but also the ability to project an image of strength and divine sanction. Urraca's legacy influenced Spanish queenship for centuries. She established the precedent that women could rule Spanish kingdoms in their own right, paving the way for later queens like Isabella of Castile. She also demonstrated that effective rule required military leadership, not just diplomatic skill, a lesson that would prove crucial during the later stages of the Reconquista. Moving forward to the 13th century, we encounter one of medieval Europe's most culturally sophisticated but politically chaotic royal courts. Alfonso X of Castile, known as the Wise, created a court that was simultaneously a center of learning and a hotbed of scandal, largely due to the influence of the women around him. Alfonso's queen, Violent of Aragon, was a political powerhouse who often overshadowed her scholarly husband. While Alfonso was busy translating Arabic texts and writing poetry, Violent was managing the practical business of ruling a kingdom that was constantly at war with Muslim Granada and dealing with noble rebellions. But the real drama centered around Alfonso's relationship with his mistress, Mare Guillen de Guzman. This wasn't a discreet affair. Alfonso openly acknowledged Mare as his partner and gave their children important positions in the royal hierarchy. Their daughter Beatrice was married to Afonso III of Portugal, while their son was granted extensive lands and titles. What made this situation particularly scandalous was that Mare wasn't a noble. She was from a relatively modest background, which meant Alfonso was openly defying social conventions about royal marriages and relationships. The church condemned the relationship. The nobility were scandalized, and Queen Violent was furious. But Alfonso didn't care. He was infatuated with Mare and made no attempt to hide it. The situation became even more complex when Mare died in 1262. Alfonso was devastated, but instead of returning to his wife, he began a series of relationships with other women. including several members of his own court. These relationships produced more illegitimate children, created more political complications, and further undermined Alfonso's relationship with both the church and the nobility. Queen. Violence response was to essentially create her own parallel court. She gathered around herself a circle of noble women, scholars, and artists who supported her rather than Alfonso. This created a situation where Castile effectively had two royal courts competing for influence and loyalty. The competition between Violent and Alfonso's various mistresses created opportunities for noble families to play both sides. Families with daughters in Violent's circle could gain access to certain types of royal patronage, while those with connections to Alfonso's mistresses could access others. This made the Castilian court incredibly complex and constantly shifting. But perhaps the most significant consequence was how this dysfunction affected royal succession. Alfonso and Violent's eldest son Fernando died young, leading to a succession crisis that would plague Castile for decades. Their younger son Sancho eventually rebelled against his father, with support from nobles who were frustrated by Alfonso's focus on learning rather than governing. The rebellion against Alfonso was partly driven by his neglect of traditional royal duties, but it was also influenced by the scandals surrounding his personal life. Many nobles felt that a king who couldn't control his own household wasn't qualified to rule a kingdom. Queen Violent found herself in the impossible position of supporting her son's rebellion against her husband, but the most famous Spanish queen, and arguably one of the most influential women in world history, was Isabella of Castile, who ruled from 1474 to 1504. Isabella's reign marked the culmination of the Reconquista, the unification of Spain, and the beginning of Spanish colonial expansion that would reshape the global balance of power. Isabella's path to power was neither easy nor guaranteed. When her half-brother Henry IV of Castile died in 1474, there were multiple claimants to the throne, including Henry's daughter Joanna, whose legitimacy was questioned by many nobles. Isabella's claim was stronger legally, but she still had to fight a 5-year civil war to secure her throne. What made Isabella remarkable wasn't just her military and political success, but her partnership with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage in 1469 was a love match that also happened to be brilliant politics. It united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain and created the foundation for modern Spanish unity. But Isabella wasn't content to be a junior partner in this alliance. She negotiated a marriage contract that preserved her authority as Queen of Castile, while also creating mechanisms for joint decision-making with Ferdinand. This was revolutionary for its time. Most royal marriages involved the wife's authority being subsumed into her husband's, but Isabella maintained her independence while also creating an effective partnership. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492, with the conquest of Granada, was largely due to Isabella's determination and organizational skills. She personally supervised the military campaigns, managed the complex logistics of siege warfare, and negotiated the political agreements that made victory possible. When Granada finally surrendered, Isabella and Ferdinand entered the city together as joint conquerors, symbolizing the new unified Spain they had created. But Isabella's legacy is complicated by her role in establishing the Spanish Inquisition and expelling Jews from Spain in 1492. These policies, while popular with many of her Christian subjects, caused enormous suffering and weakened Spain economically by driving out many skilled artisans and merchants. Isabella's decision to support Christopher Columbus's voyages also had world-changing consequences. When Columbus approached European monarchs seeking support for his proposed voyage to Asia, most rejected his plans as unrealistic. Isabella was the only ruler willing to take the risk, financing Columbus's expeditions that led to European contact with the Americas. The wealth that flowed from American colonies made Spain the dominant European power for the next century and a half. But this wealth also came at enormous cost to indigenous American populations, who were devastated by disease, warfare, and exploitation. Isabella's legacy thus includes both the creation of the first global empire and responsibility for some of history's most devastating colonial policies. Isabella's approach to queenship also influenced royal women across Europe. She demonstrated that queens could be effective military leaders, successful diplomats, and powerful rulers without sacrificing their roles as wives and mothers. She bore 5 children who survived to adulthood and arranged their marriages to create alliances that extended Spanish influence across Europe. Her daughter Catherine of Aragon became Queen of England. Her daughter Joanna inherited Castile, though she suffered from mental illness that limited her effectiveness. And her daughters, Isabella and Maria, became queens of Portugal. Through these marriage alliances, Isabella created a network of Spanish influence that extended from London to Lisbon. But Spanish queenship also had a uniquely dark side that reflected the religious and cultural conflicts of the Reconquista period. The centuries-long struggle between Christian and Islamic forces created a political environment where queens were expected to be not just rulers, but crusaders for the faith. Take Joanna, the Mad, Isabella's daughter who inherited Castile in 1504. Joanna's tragedy wasn't just personal, mental illness. It was the result of a political system that had no mechanism for dealing with a queen who couldn't fulfill her expected roles. When Joanna began showing signs of severe depression and possible schizophrenia after her husband Philip's death in 1506, the response wasn't medical treatment but political manipulation. Joanna's father, Ferdinand, used her condition as justification for maintaining his authority over Castile, arguing that she was unfit to rule. Her son Charles, later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, continued this arrangement, keeping Joanna confined to a palace while ruling in her name. For nearly 50 years, Joanna was technically Queen of Castile, but had no real authority or freedom. What made Joanna's situation particularly tragic was that her madness may have been largely a result of grief and political pressure, rather than genuine mental illness. Contemporary accounts describe her extreme devotion to her deceased husband Philip, including her refusal to allow his body to be buried and her habit of traveling with his coffin. While this behavior was certainly unusual, it may have been more about political symbolism than mental breakdown. Joanna understood that her authority as queen depended partly on her connection to Philip, who had been king consort. By maintaining physical possession of his body, she was asserting her continued legitimacy as his widow and the mother of his heirs. But this behavior was easily interpreted as madness by political rivals who wanted to exclude her from power. The treatment of Joanna established dangerous precedents for how royal women could be marginalized through accusations of mental instability. Later queens across Europe would face similar challenges when their behavior didn't conform to expected norms. Even more disturbing was the role of Spanish queens in the Inquisition. While Isabella established the institution, her successors were expected to actively participate in religious persecution. Queens were present at auto da fe ceremonies where heretics were burned alive, and they were expected to demonstrate their Catholic orthodoxy through support for these brutal spectacles. This created moral compromises that haunted Spanish queenship for centuries. Women who might have been personally horrified by religious violence were forced to participate in it as proof of their loyalty to Catholic Spain. Those who showed any reluctance faced accusations of secret sympathy for heretics. When Joanna's son Charles V inherited the Spanish throne, Spanish queenship became entangled with the broader politics of the Habsburg dynasty. Charles's marriage to Isabella of Portugal in 1526 brought a new model of queenship that emphasized dynastic loyalty over national interests. Isabella of Portugal was expected to serve Habsburg interests rather than specifically Spanish ones, creating tensions between her roles as Queen of Spain and member of an international dynasty. When Charles was absent from Spain, which was frequently, Isabella served as regent, but her decisions were often influenced by Habsburg policies that conflicted with Spanish interests. This pattern continued with Charles's son Philip II, whose marriages were dictated entirely by European power politics. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died young. His second wife, Mary I of England, brought Spain into English politics. And his third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was part of a peace treaty with France. None of these marriages were designed to benefit Spain specifically. They were all about advancing Habsburg hegemony in Europe. The result was that Spanish queens became increasingly disconnected from Spanish interests and Spanish people. They were symbols of Spanish power, but their actual loyalties were to a dynasty that treated Spain as one piece in a much larger political game. Around the major queens who dominated medieval politics, dozens of lesser-known royal women played crucial supporting roles in the great dramas of their time. These weren't bit players. They were accomplished politicians, military leaders, and cultural patrons who shaped medieval society in ways that are only now being recognized by historians. Take Matilda of Tuscany, the great countess who controlled vast territories in northern Italy during the 11th and 12th centuries. Matilda wasn't technically a queen, but she wielded more real power than most crowned monarchs. She commanded her own armies, built and destroyed castles, and played a crucial role in the investiture controversy between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Matilda's military career was remarkable by any standard. She personally led troops in over 30 battles, winning most of them through superior strategy and logistics rather than brute force. When Emperor Henry IV crossed the Alps to attack her territories, Matilda orchestrated a defense that forced him to retreat in humiliation. She understood that warfare was as much about economics and morale as it was about fighting. But Matilda's most famous moment came during Henry IV's dramatic submission to Pope Gregory VII at Canossa in 1077. Matilda arranged the meeting, managed the negotiations, and provided the fortress where the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for papal forgiveness. This wasn't just diplomatic theater. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of how spiritual authority could triumph over secular power. Equally impressive was Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France twice during the 13th century. Blanche came to France as a 12-year-old bride for Louis VIII, but she quickly mastered French politics with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and religious devotion that impressed even her enemies. When Louis VIII died in 1226, leaving Blanche as regent for the 12-year-old Louis IX, later St. Louis, many nobles expected the kingdom to descend into chaos. Instead, Blanche systematically defeated rebel coalitions, negotiated favorable treaties, and established an administrative system that would serve as the foundation for absolute monarchy in France. Blanche's methods were sometimes brutal. She besieged rebel castles until they surrendered, confiscated the lands of disobedient nobles, and reportedly had several opponents assassinated when legal methods proved insufficient. But she also patronized religious institutions, promoted learning, and created economic policies that brought prosperity to France. Now let's dive into one of the most scandalous marriage controversies of the Carolingian Empire. Judith of Bavaria, who became empress in 819 when she married Louis the Pious, managed to trigger a civil war that nearly destroyed Charlemagne's empire, all because she refused to accept the political limitations of being a second wife. Louis the Pious was already in his 40s when he married Judith, and he already had 3 adult sons from his first marriage. The expectation was that Judith would be a decorative consort, who would provide companionship for the aging emperor while his sons inherited the empire. But Judith had other plans. Within a year of marriage, Judith gave birth to a son, Charles, later known as Charles the Bold. Suddenly, there was a 4th heir to consider in the imperial succession. But instead of accepting a minor role for her son, Judith began campaigning for Charles to receive an equal share of the empire. This wasn't just maternal ambition. It was a direct challenge to Carolingian succession traditions. The scandal deepened when rumors began circulating about Judith's relationship with Bernard of Septimania, one of Louis's most powerful courtiers. Whether the relationship was romantic or purely political, Judith and Bernard worked together to advance Charles's claims to imperial inheritance. Their alliance was so close that many suspected Charles might actually be Bernard's son rather than Louis's dot in 830. Louis's older sons launched a rebellion against their father, claiming that Judith was corrupting imperial government through her inappropriate relationships and excessive influence. The rebels forced Louis to send Judith to a monastery and executed Bernard on charges of adultery and treason. But Judith wasn't finished. From her monastery, she maintained correspondence with loyal supporters and gradually built a coalition to restore her position. In 831, she managed to return to court and convince Louis to reinstate her as empress. Her political comeback was one of the most impressive recoveries in medieval royal history. The civil wars continued for years, with Judith's son Charles fighting his half-brothers for imperial territory. The conflict was so destructive that it permanently weakened Carolingian authority and contributed to the eventual fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire. What made Judith's story particularly scandalous was her refusal to accept the traditional limitations of stepmotherhood. Previous Carolingian empresses had typically deferred to the claims of their husbands' older children from previous marriages. Judith rejected this model entirely, demanding equal treatment for her son and equal recognition for her own political authority. Her methods were sometimes questionable. The relationship with Bernard created legitimate concerns about adultery and treason, but her goals were revolutionary for their time. She was essentially arguing that imperial succession should be based on merit and political capability rather than birth order, and that empresses should have the right to advocate for their children's interests. Judith's legacy influenced how later medieval queens approached similar situations. Her example showed that determined royal women could challenge traditional succession practices, but it also demonstrated the enormous costs of such challenges. The civil wars she triggered lasted for decades and fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Europe. These women didn't operate in isolation. They were part of complex networks of relationships that spanned continents and generations. Royal marriages created webs of kinship that connected kingdoms from Portugal to Poland, and these connections often proved more important than formal diplomatic agreements. Consider how Eleanor of Aquitaine's descendants influenced politics across Europe for centuries. A daughter, Marie, became Countess of Champagne and patronized the development of courtly literature. Her daughter, Eleanor, became Queen of Castile and established cultural connections between France and Spain. Her granddaughter, Blanche, became Queen of France and shaped French politics for decades. These family networks created both opportunities and obligations for medieval queens. A queen could call on her relatives for military support, financial assistance, or diplomatic intervention. But she was also expected to support her family's interests, even when they conflicted with her adopted kingdom's needs. The marriage between Isabella of Hainault and Philip Augustus of France illustrates these complex relationships. Isabella brought the county of Artois as her dowry, significantly expanding French territory. But her marriage also created tensions. With the Holy Roman Empire since Hainault was technically an imperial fief. These competing loyalties influenced French foreign policy for generations. Religious institutions provided another layer of connection between medieval queens. Many royal women served as patrons of specific monasteries or religious orders, creating spiritual networks that paralleled political ones. These religious connections allowed queens to communicate across political boundaries and sometimes provided sanctuary when political situations became dangerous. To understand medieval queens, you have to understand the cultural expectations that shaped their world. Royal women lived in a society that simultaneously idealized and constrained female behavior. They were expected to be models of Christian virtue while exercising political authority that often required decidedly unchristian methods. The concept of courtly love, which emerged in the 12th century, created new expectations for royal behavior. Queens were supposed to inspire devotion and loyalty through their beauty and grace. But this idealization often masked the harsh realities of political power. A queen who was too virtuous might be seen as weak, while one who was too aggressive might be condemned as unnatural. Religious beliefs added another layer of complexity. Medieval Christianity taught that women were inherently inferior to men and should be subject to male authority. Yet the same religion provided examples of powerful female saints and biblical queens who had exercised legitimate authority. Queens had to navigate between these competing models, presenting themselves as both humble Christians and effective rulers. The economic realities of medieval life also shaped queenly behavior. Royal women typically controlled significant resources through their dower lands, inheritance rights, and marriage settlements. This economic power gave them real influence in a world where money could buy armies, build castles, and purchase loyalty. Perhaps most ironic was how medieval society's attempts to control and limit female power often created opportunities for clever women to accumulate even more authority. Legal restrictions on female inheritance led to complex marriage negotiations that gave royal women significant bargaining power. Religious teachings about female submission were balanced by examples of powerful biblical queens and female saints. The most successful medieval queens were those who understood how to work within these contradictions rather than against them. They presented themselves as dutiful wives and mothers while quietly building networks of power and influence. They used religious devotion as a shield against criticism while pursuing decidedly secular political goals. Consider how Marguerite of Provence, wife of Louis IX of France, managed to exercise significant political influence while maintaining a reputation for piety and virtue. She accompanied Louis on crusade, managed royal finances during his absence, and negotiated with hostile nobles, all while presenting herself as a model Christian queen devoted to her husband's spiritual mission. Everything changed in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, when the medieval world order began to crack under pressure from multiple directions. The Crusades were failing, plague was spreading, and new military technologies were making traditional feudal warfare obsolete. Most significantly for royal women, the rise of centralized monarchies and university-educated administrators was creating new forms of government that had less room for the informal power networks that queens had traditionally used. The turning point can be traced to several interconnected developments. First, the growth of royal bureaucracies meant that kings relied less on personal relationships and more on professional administrators. Queens found themselves increasingly excluded from decision-making processes that had previously depended on their networks and influence. Second, the revival of Roman law in universities across Europe provided intellectual justification for absolute monarchy and male supremacy. Legal scholars argued that political authority should be centralized in the hands of kings who derived their power directly from God, not from the complex web of relationships that had characterized feudal society. Third, the church was undergoing its own transformation, with increasing emphasis on clerical celibacy and female submission. The rise of scholastic theology provided new arguments for why women were inherently unsuited for political authority, even as regent mothers or queen consorts. Finally, economic changes were altering the basis of royal power. The growth of towns and trade was creating new forms of wealth that didn't depend on land ownership. This undermined the traditional system, where queens derived their influence from controlling agricultural estates and managing household economies. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that played out over several generations. The first signs appeared during the reign of Philip IV of France, 1285 to 1314, who systematically reduced the political role of royal women while expanding the power of professional administrators and lawyers. Philip's approach to queenship was revolutionary in its restrictiveness. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied heavily on queens and queen mothers for political advice and diplomatic negotiations, Philip created a court structure that marginalized royal women. He surrounded himself with university-educated counselors who owed their positions to professional competence rather than family connections. Suppression of the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1314 exemplified this new approach to royal authority. Philip orchestrated the destruction of one of medieval Europe's most powerful institutions without consulting his queen or seeking the kind of broad, noble support that previous kings had needed for major political actions. This was centralized monarchy in action, decisive, efficient, and largely independent of traditional power networks. Similar changes were occurring across Europe. In England, Edward I, 1272 to 1307, reduced the political influence of queens while expanding royal control over legal systems and taxation. In the Holy Roman Empire, emperors began relying more heavily on professional diplomats and administrators rather than the marriage alliances that had traditionally bound the empire together. But the most dramatic transformation occurred in France during the reigns of Philip IV's sons. The rapid succession of Louis X, 1314 to 1316, Philip V, 1316 to 1322, and Charles IV, 1322 to 1328, created a succession crisis that would normally have been resolved through complex negotiations involving queen mothers, dowager queens, and female heirs. Instead, the French nobility adopted Salic law, which completely excluded women from royal succession. This wasn't just a technical legal change. It was a fundamental redefinition of monarchy that eliminated the most important source of female political power. Queens could no longer serve as links between dynasties or as potential rulers in their own right. The English response to French Salic law sparked the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, which paradoxically created new opportunities for some queens while restricting others. The demands of prolonged warfare required more sophisticated administrative systems and more centralized authority. But they also created situations where queens had to serve as regents during their husbands' military campaigns. By the mid-14th century, a new model of queenship had emerged that was simultaneously more limited and more defined than its medieval predecessor. Queens still wielded significant influence, but that influence was increasingly channeled through formal institutions rather than personal networks. The new queens were expected to be cultural patrons, diplomatic ambassadors, and symbols of royal magnificence, but they were largely excluded from the day-to-day business of governance. They maintained their own courts, managed extensive household staffs, and served as intermediaries between the crown and various social groups, but they rarely participated directly in policy decisions. This transformation created both opportunities and constraints. On one hand, queens were freed from some of the dangerous political responsibilities that had made medieval queenship such a high-risk occupation. They were less likely to be accused of treason, less likely to be imprisoned by rival factions, and less likely to die violently. On the other hand, the new system made queens more dependent on their husband's favor and more vulnerable to changes in royal policy. A queen who lost her husband's support could find herself completely isolated, with no independent power base and no traditional rights to fall back on. The cultural expectations of queenship also became more demanding and more specific. Queens were expected to embody ideals of feminine virtue while also demonstrating royal magnificence. They had to master complex court ceremonies, patronize appropriate cultural activities, and maintain elaborate households that reflected the glory of the monarchy. Isabella's career revealed the fundamental contradictions of medieval queenship. She was expected to be loyal to her husband and kingdom, yet she was also expected to advance her family's interests and maintain her own political independence. These competing demands created impossible situations where queens had to choose between personal happiness, political advantage, and family loyalty. The Plantagenet queens also demonstrated how the expansion of royal power created new opportunities and constraints for royal women. As kingdoms became larger and more centralized, queens gained access to greater resources and authority. But they also became more visible targets for criticism and rebellion. Most importantly, the Plantagenet dynasty showed how personal relationships could have international consequences in medieval politics. Isabella's marriages affected the balance of power between England and France for generations. Her choices influenced trade relationships, military alliances, and cultural exchanges across Western Europe. Dot around the major queens who dominated medieval politics, dozens of lesser-known royal women played crucial supporting roles in the great dramas of their time. These weren't bit players, they were accomplished politicians, military leaders, and cultural patrons who shaped medieval society in ways that are only now being recognized by historians. Take Matilda of Tuscany, the great countess who controlled vast territories in northern Italy during the 11th and 12th centuries. Matilda wasn't technically a queen, but she wielded more real power than most crowned monarchs. She commanded her own armies, built and destroyed castles, and played a crucial role in the investiture controversy between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Matilda's military career was remarkable by any standard. She personally led troops in over 30 battles, winning most of them through superior strategy and logistics rather than brute force. When Emperor Henry IV crossed the Alps to attack her territories, Matilda orchestrated a defense that forced him to retreat in humiliation. She understood that warfare was as much about economics and morale as it was about fighting. But Matilda's most famous moment came during Henry IV's dramatic submission to Pope Gregory VII at Canossa in 1077. Matilda arranged the meeting, managed the negotiations, and provided the fortress where the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for papal forgiveness. This wasn't just diplomatic theater. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of how spiritual authority could triumph over secular power. What made Matilda particularly dangerous to imperial authority was her understanding of propaganda and public relations. She commissioned artworks and literary works that portrayed her as a divinely appointed defender of the church, while depicting her enemies as enemies of God. She also used her control of mountain passes to strangle imperial supply lines, demonstrating how geographical advantages could be used to defeat much larger armies. Equally impressive was Blanche of Castile, who served as regent of France twice during the 13th century. Blanche came to France as a 12-year-old bride for Louis VIII, but she quickly mastered French politics with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and religious devotion that impressed even her enemies. When Louis VIII died in 1226, leaving Blanche as regent for the 12-year-old Louis IX, later St. Louis. Many nobles expected the kingdom to descend into chaos. Instead, Blanche systematically defeated rebel coalitions, negotiated favorable treaties, and established an administrative system that would serve as the foundation for absolute monarchy in France. Blanche's methods were sometimes brutal. She besieged rebel castles until they surrendered, confiscated the lands of disobedient nobles, and reportedly had several opponents assassinated when legal methods proved insufficient. But she also patronized religious institutions, promoted learning, and created economic policies that brought prosperity to France. What distinguished Blanche from many other regents was her understanding of the symbolic dimensions of royal authority. She regularly appeared in public wearing royal regalia, held elaborate court ceremonies that demonstrated royal magnificence, and used religious festivals to reinforce the connection between monarchy and divine authority. Blanche also pioneered new forms of female political authority that would influence later queens. She established a network of female religious houses that served as centers of education and political influence. These institutions trained noble daughters in administration, diplomacy, and cultural patronage, while also providing Blanche with intelligence networks that extended across France. Her relationship with her son Louis IX was complex and sometimes tense. As Louis grew older, he increasingly resented his mother's continued influence over royal policy. But Blanche was too skilled a politician to be easily displaced. She gradually transitioned from regent to advisor, maintaining her influence while allowing Louis to assume the appearance of independent authority. When Louis IX departed for the Seventh Crusade in 1248, he appointed Blanche as regent again, demonstrating his continued confidence in her abilities despite their personal tensions. Blanche's second regency was even more successful than her first, as she had learned from experience how to balance competing interests and maintain stability during royal absence. The network of relationships that Blanche created during her regencies influenced French politics for generations. Noble families that had supported her retained advantages long after her death, while those that had opposed her found themselves gradually excluded from royal favor. She essentially created a new French political elite that was loyal to centralized monarchy rather than regional autonomy. Then there's Marguerite de Provence, wife of Louis IX, who demonstrated how queens could exercise significant influence while maintaining reputations for piety and virtue. Marguerite accompanied Louis on the Seventh Crusade, where she served as his chief advisor and managed royal finances while he was focused on military operations. During the disastrous Egyptian campaign of 1249 to 1250, when Louis was captured by Muslim forces, Marguerite effectively became the leader of the crusading expedition. She negotiated the king's ransom, managed the retreat of Christian forces, and maintained morale during one of the darkest periods in crusading history. Marguerite's performance during the crisis established her as one of the most respected queens. In medieval Europe, she had demonstrated that royal women could provide effective leadership during military emergencies, while also fulfilling their traditional roles as wives and mothers. She gave birth to her son Zhang while in Egypt, showing that even pregnancy and childbirth couldn't prevent queens from fulfilling their political responsibilities. While Western European queens have received most historical attention, Eastern Europe produced equally remarkable royal women who operated in even more challenging political environments. These queens had to navigate not just male-dominated courts, but also conflicts between Christianity and paganism, struggles between different Christian denominations, and the constant threat of invasion from steppe nomads. Jadwiga of Poland, who ruled from 1384 to 1399, was crowned as king rather than queen to emphasize her authority as a ruler in her own right. She inherited the Polish throne at age 10 and immediately became the focus of international marriage negotiations designed to secure Poland's borders and religious unity. The most significant of these negotiations involved her marriage to Jagai, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. This marriage wasn't just a personal union. It was the foundation for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of medieval Europe's largest and most powerful states. But the marriage required Jogaila to convert from paganism to Christianity and to bring Lithuania into the Catholic fold. Jadwiga's role in this conversion was crucial. She wasn't just a passive symbol of Christian unity. She actively participated in missionary activities, established schools and churches in Lithuania, and used her personal influence to encourage noble Lithuanian families to abandon their traditional religion. But Jadwiga's reign also demonstrated the limits of female royal authority in Eastern Europe. Despite being crowned as king, she was constantly pressured to defer to her husband's authority in military and diplomatic matters. When she attempted to assert independent authority over religious policy, she faced resistance from both the church hierarchy and Polish nobles, who questioned whether a woman could legitimately exercise spiritual leadership. Even more remarkable was Anna of Kiev, who became Queen of France in 1051 when she married Henry, the first Anna brought to the French court a level of education and cultural sophistication that was unprecedented in Western Europe. She was literate in multiple languages, familiar with Byzantine political practices, and experienced in the complex diplomacy of Eastern European courts. Anna's influence on French culture was profound and lasting. She introduced new forms of court ceremony, patronized scholars and artists, and established connections between French and Eastern European intellectual traditions. Her court became a center for cultural exchange that influenced the development of medieval learning. But Anna also faced unique challenges as a foreign queen in France. Her Orthodox Christian background made her suspect to Catholic clergy. Her unfamiliar customs were criticized by French nobles, and her political advice was often dismissed as reflecting dangerous foreign influences. When Henry I died in 1060, Anna's position became even more precarious. As Queen Mother for the young Philip I, she was expected to serve as regent. But French nobles were uncomfortable with her foreign background and Orthodox religious practices. She eventually married a French noble and withdrew from court politics. But her influence on French culture continued through the institutions she had established. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval queenship was the complex relationship between royal authority and religious devotion. Many queens used religious institutions as sources of power and influence, while others found their political ambitions constrained by religious expectations. Radegund of Poitiers, who lived in the 6th century, represents an extreme example of this tension. Radegund was married to Clotaire I, king of the Franks, but she abandoned her royal position to found a monastery at Poitiers. This wasn't just personal religious devotion. It was a calculated rejection of the limitations that queenship imposed on her. Spiritual and intellectual ambitions. As abbess of her own monastery, Radegund wielded authority that would have been impossible as queen. She managed extensive landholdings, supervised the education of noble daughters, and maintained correspondence with religious and political leaders across Europe. Her monastery became a center of learning that preserved classical texts and promoted scholarship during the Dark Ages. But Radegund's choice also demonstrated the impossible demands placed on medieval queens. She couldn't be both an effective ruler and an authentic Christian. The political compromises required by royal authority were incompatible with the moral purity expected of religious leaders. Similar tensions affected later queens who tried to combine political authority with religious devotion. Margaret of Scotland, who became queen in 1070, attempted to use her royal position to promote religious reform and cultural development. She established schools, reformed religious practices, and promoted Anglo-Saxon culture in Scotland. But Margaret's reforms created political problems that undermined her effectiveness as queen. Scottish nobles resented her attempts to impose foreign religious practices, while English influences at her court were seen as threatening Scottish independence. Her religious devotion, while genuine, was also politically problematic because it aligned her with English rather than Scottish traditions. Elizabeth of Hungary, who lived in the 13th century, faced similar contradictions between royal duty and religious calling. As the wife of Ludwig IV of Thuringia, she was expected to support her husband's political and military activities. But her extreme religious devotion, including her practice of giving away royal resources to feed the poor, created conflicts with noble supporters who expected royal wealth to support their own interests. When Ludwig died in 1227, Elizabeth's religious practices became even more controversial. She distributed most of her inheritance to religious institutions and poor relief, leaving little for her children's political advancement. This was seen as irresponsible by many nobles who expected royal mothers to prioritize dynastic interests over religious charity. These women didn't operate in isolation. They were part of complex networks of relationships that spanned continents and generations. Royal marriages created webs of kinship that connected kingdoms from Portugal to Poland, and these connections often proved more important than formal diplomatic agreements. Consider how Eleanor of Aquitaine's descendants influenced politics across Europe for centuries. Her daughter Marie became Countess of Champagne and patronized the development of courtly literature. Her daughter Eleanor became Queen of Castile and established cultural connections between France and Spain. Her granddaughter Blanche became Queen of France and shaped French politics for decades. These family networks created both opportunities and obligations for medieval queens. A queen could call on her relatives for military support, financial assistance, or diplomatic intervention. But she was also expected to support her family's interests even when they conflicted with her. Adopted kingdoms' needs. The marriage between Isabella of Hainault and Philip Augustus of France illustrates these complex relationships. Isabella brought the county of Artois as her dowry, significantly expanding French territory. But her marriage also created tensions with the Holy Roman Empire, since Hainault was technically an imperial fief. These competing loyalties influenced French foreign policy for generations. Religious institutions provided another layer of connection between medieval queens. Many royal women served as patrons of specific monasteries or religious orders, creating spiritual networks that paralleled political ones. These religious connections allowed queens to communicate across political boundaries and sometimes provided sanctuary when political situations became dangerous. The network of Cistercian monasteries, for example, connected queens across Europe through shared religious devotion and institutional loyalty. Queens who patronized Cistercian houses could rely on support from other royal patrons of the order, creating informal alliances that transcended national boundaries. Cultural exchanges also created lasting connections between royal courts. Queens, who brought artists, scholars, or musicians from their birth countries to their new kingdoms, created cultural links that influenced literature, art, and learning for generations. These cultural networks were often more durable than political alliances, continuing to operate even when kingdoms were at war. Was this change positive or negative for royal women? The answer depends on perspective and circumstances. From one viewpoint, the new system provided greater security and clearer expectations. Queens no longer had to navigate the deadly uncertainties of medieval politics, where a single mistake could trigger civil war or dynastic collapse. The emergence of more formal court structures also created new opportunities for cultural patronage and artistic expression. Renaissance queens like Isabella d'Este and Catherine de Medici would use these opportunities to become some of history's most influential cultural figures, shaping art, literature, and intellectual life in ways that had lasting impact. But from another perspective, the transformation represented a significant loss of female political power. Medieval queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile had wielded authority that was real, immediate, and consequential. They made decisions that affected the lives of millions and shaped the political development of entire kingdoms. The new model of queenship was more ornamental and less substantive. While Renaissance and early modern queens could influence cultural trends and social customs, they rarely had the kind of direct political authority that their medieval predecessors had taken for granted. Perhaps most significantly, the change reflected broader shifts in European society toward more centralized, bureaucratic forms of government that had less room for the personal relationships and informal networks that had characterized medieval politics. This wasn't necessarily progress. It was simply change, with its own benefits and costs. Down in the centuries following the great transformation of the 14th century, queenship evolved into something that would have been almost unrecognizable to Eleanor of Aquitaine or her contemporaries. The Renaissance and early modern periods created new models of female royal authority that were simultaneously more refined and more restricted than their medieval predecessors. The Italian Renaissance provided the first glimpse of this new form of queenship. Women like Isabella d'Este of Mantua and Caterina Sforza of Forch demonstrated that royal women could still wield significant influence, but through cultural patronage and diplomatic sophistication, rather than military command or direct political control. Isabella d'Este, often called the First Lady of the Renaissance, created a court at Mantua that became the cultural center of northern Italy. She commissioned works from Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, and other master artists while maintaining correspondence with rulers across Europe. Her influence was real and substantial, but it operated through cultural networks rather than political institutions. The Habsburg dynasty perfected this new model of queenship during the 16th and 17th centuries. Habsburg queens like Maria Theresa of Austria demonstrated that women could still rule effectively, but within a much more structured and formal system than had existed during the medieval period. Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg territories in 1740 and ruled for 40 years, successfully defending her inheritance against multiple challengers while modernizing Austrian administration and military organization. But her authority was based on legal succession and administrative competence rather than the personal networks and informal power structures that had characterized medieval queenship. The emergence of absolute monarchy in France under Louis XIV created yet another model for royal women. Queens like Maria Theresa of Spain and later Marie Antoinette found themselves in positions of enormous symbolic importance, but limited political authority. They were expected to embody royal magnificence and serve as diplomatic symbols, but they were largely excluded from actual governance. The transformation of queenship created opportunities for new types of female leaders who operated outside traditional royal structures. The rise of powerful noble families, wealthy merchant dynasties, and influential religious orders provided alternative paths to power for ambitious women. Catherine de Medici represents this new breed of female leader. Although she became Queen of France through marriage to Henry II, her real power came from her family's banking empire and her sophisticated understanding of Renaissance politics. When Henry died in 1559, Catherine served as regent for 3 of her sons who successively became kings of France. Catherine's regency was markedly different from medieval precedents. Instead of relying on personal relationships and traditional feudal obligations, she created a professional administrative system staffed by loyal bureaucrats. She used religious policy, marriage diplomacy, and financial manipulation to maintain royal authority during the devastating French Wars of Religion. But Catherine also demonstrated how the new system could be more brutal than its medieval predecessor. Her alleged role in planning the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, which killed thousands of French Protestants, showed how centralized royal authority could be used for systematic persecution, rather than the more limited violence that had characterized medieval conflicts. Elizabeth, I of England, represents perhaps the most successful adaptation to the new model of queenship. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by religious conflict and threatened by foreign invasion, but she managed to create a new form of royal authority that combined traditional monarchical power with Renaissance sophistication. Elizabeth's approach to queenship was revolutionary in its self-consciousness. She deliberately crafted a public image as the Virgin Queen who was married to England itself, using her unmarried status as a diplomatic tool while avoiding the limitations that marriage would have imposed on her authority. The Elizabethan court became a carefully orchestrated theater where every ceremony, every costume, and every public appearance was designed to reinforce the Queen's authority. This wasn't the informal, personal leadership style of medieval queens. It was a highly sophisticated form of political performance that required constant attention and careful management. Elizabeth also pioneered new forms of female authority that would influence royal women for centuries. Her use of progresses, elaborate tours through her kingdom, allowed her to maintain personal contact with her subjects while demonstrating royal magnificence. Her patronage of theater, music, and literature created cultural achievements that enhanced England's international prestige, but some fundamental problems persisted despite these innovations. The question of female succession remained contentious throughout the early modern period, with different kingdoms adopting different solutions to the problem of queens regnant. The Salic law, that excluded women from succession in France, continued to influence European politics for centuries. The French rejection of female succession became a model for other kingdoms, seeking to avoid the complications that female rulers could create for international diplomacy and domestic stability. England's acceptance of female succession, by contrast, created a different set of challenges. The reigns of Mary I and Elizabeth I demonstrated that women could rule effectively, but they also raised questions about marriage, succession, and the relationship between gender roles and political authority that would resurface repeatedly. In later centuries, the religious dimensions of queenship became increasingly complex during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Protestant kingdoms developed different expectations for royal women than Catholic ones, creating new sources of international tension and domestic controversy. Queens in Protestant countries were expected to serve as models of reformed piety, while also maintaining the magnificence and ceremonial grandeur that reinforced royal authority. This created challenging contradictions between religious ideals that emphasized simplicity and humility and political necessities that required elaborate display and costly ceremony. Catholic queens faced different but equally complex challenges. The Counter-Reformation placed new emphasis on female religious devotion and charitable activity, but it also reinforced traditional teachings about female submission and male authority that could conflict with the practical requirements of royal leadership. Comparing early modern queenship with its medieval predecessor reveals both continuities and dramatic changes. Medieval queens had operated in a world where personal relationships, informal networks, and flexible traditions provided multiple paths to power and influence. Early modern queens lived in a more structured environment where formal institutions, legal precedents, and bureaucratic procedures defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The medieval system had been more dangerous, but also more fluid. A clever and determined woman like Eleanor of Aquitaine could accumulate enormous power through strategic marriages, political alliances, and personal charisma. But she could also lose everything through a single miscalculation or shift in political circumstances. The early modern system was safer, but more constraining. Queens like Elizabeth I or Maria Theresa operated within well-defined legal and constitutional frameworks that provided security, but also limited their options. They could exercise substantial authority, but only within predetermined channels and according to established precedents. The cultural expectations of queenship also evolved significantly. Medieval queens had been expected to be competent political actors who could hold their own in a world of warfare, diplomacy, and intrigue. Early modern queens were expected to be cultural symbols who embodied ideals of femininity, piety, and royal magnificence while avoiding direct involvement in the messy business of governance. This shift reflected broader changes in European society, including the growth of professional bureaucracies, the influence of humanist education, and the impact of religious reform movements. The emergence of the printing press also changed how royal women related to their subjects, creating new opportunities for propaganda and public relations, but also new vulnerabilities to criticism and scandal. Perhaps most significantly, the transformation of queenship reflected changing ideas about gender, power, and political legitimacy. Medieval society had been more comfortable with informal, personal forms of authority that could accommodate powerful women without requiring extensive theoretical justification. Early modern society increasingly demanded legal and philosophical rationales for political authority, creating both new opportunities and new constraints for royal women. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the traditional model of European queenship was showing signs of strain. The rise of Enlightenment philosophy, with its emphasis on rational government and natural rights, created new challenges for institutions based on hereditary privilege and divine right. Royal women found themselves caught between traditional expectations and emerging ideas about merit, equality, and popular sovereignty. The growing influence of public opinion, facilitated by the expansion of literacy and the proliferation of newspapers and pamphlets, meant that queens could no longer control their public image through court ceremony and official propaganda alone. Royal behavior was increasingly subject to public scrutiny and criticism, creating new pressures and vulnerabilities. The economic transformations of the early modern period also undermined traditional sources of royal authority. The growth of commercial capitalism, colonial trade, and financial markets created new forms of wealth that operated independently of royal patronage. Successful merchants and bankers could accumulate fortunes that rivaled those of queens, reducing the monarchy's monopoly on magnificence and luxury. Military developments further eroded the traditional foundations of royal power. The emergence of professional armies, advanced artillery, and complex fortification systems made warfare increasingly expensive and technical. Queens could no longer rely on personal loyalty and feudal obligations to raise armies. They needed professional military establishments, funded by efficient taxation systems. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries had also damaged the sacred character of monarchy. When kings and queens claimed divine sanction for opposing sides in religious conflicts, their claims to represent God's will on earth became less credible. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established the principle that rulers could determine their subjects' religion, but it also implicitly acknowledged that religious truth was relative rather than absolute. The crisis came to a head during the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and would ultimately transform European monarchy forever. Marie Antoinette, the last queen of the Ancien regime, became the symbol of everything that revolutionary France sought to destroy: hereditary privilege, aristocratic excess, and female political influence operating outside democratic institutions. Marie Antoinette's tragedy was that she embodied the contradictions of 18th century queenship perfectly. She was expected to represent royal magnificence while also demonstrating domestic virtue. She was supposed to influence politics through cultural patronage and personal relationships while avoiding direct involvement in governance. She had to maintain Austria's interests as a daughter of Maria Theresa while also serving France's needs as Queen of France. The revolution's attack on Marie Antoinette was simultaneously personal and institutional. Revolutionary propagandists portrayed her as a foreign agent who manipulated her weak husband and squandered national resources on personal luxuries. But they also used her as a symbol of the broader system of hereditary monarchy that they sought to replace with democratic institutions. The trial and execution of Marie Antoinette in 1793 marked more than the death of a queen. It represented the rejection of an entire political system that had dominated Europe for over a millennium. The revolutionaries weren't just eliminating a particular ruler. They were demonstrating that royal authority had no sacred or natural foundation. The revolutionary critique of queenship extended beyond France. Across Europe, royal women found themselves defending not just their personal positions, but the entire concept of hereditary monarchy. The execution of one queen raised questions about the legitimacy of all queens, creating a crisis of confidence that would take decades to resolve. Napoleon's rise to power offered a temporary solution to this crisis. By crowning himself emperor and creating a new imperial nobility, Napoleon demonstrated that monarchy could be reinvented for the modern age. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 showed how royal women could still serve diplomatic functions, even in an era of democratic revolution. But Napoleon's empire was fundamentally different from its predecessors. It was based on military conquest and administrative efficiency, rather than traditional legitimacy and divine right. When Napoleon fell in 1815, the restored monarchies of Europe found themselves operating in a world where their authority was constantly questioned and their survival depended on popular acceptance rather than sacred tradition. The traditional model of European queenship ended because it was incompatible with the fundamental changes that transformed European society between 1650 and 1850. The rise of democratic ideology, capitalist economics, and secular culture created new forms of political legitimacy that left little room for hereditary queens, who derived their authority from birth rather than merit. The Enlightenment played a crucial role in this transformation by providing intellectual ammunition for critics of hereditary monarchy. Philosophers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau argued that legitimate government must be based on consent of the governed, rather than divine appointment or traditional privilege. These ideas didn't necessarily reject monarchy entirely, but they demanded that kings and queens justified their authority through service to their subjects rather than claims to inherited rights. Economic changes were equally important. The commercial revolution created new forms of wealth and social mobility that undermined the rigid hierarchies on which traditional monarchy depended. When merchants and manufacturers could accumulate fortunes that exceeded those of nobles, and when social position increasingly depended on economic success rather than inherited status, the entire system of hereditary privilege became questionable. The growth of professional bureaucracies also reduced the need for the personal networks and informal relationships that had been Queen's traditional sources of influence. Modern governments required trained administrators, professional diplomats, and technical experts rather than the court favorites and family connections that had characterized earlier periods. Religious changes further undermined traditional queenship. The spread of Protestant denominations that emphasized individual conscience and biblical authority made it harder to maintain that queens ruled by divine right. Even in Catholic countries, the influence of Enlightenment rationalism reduced the credibility of claims that monarchs were God's chosen representatives on earth. The immediate aftermath of the revolutionary period was complex and contradictory. While the traditional model of queenship had been decisively rejected, monarchy itself proved remarkably resilient. The restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in France in 1814, the survival of the British monarchy, and the emergence of new royal houses across Europe demonstrated that hereditary rule could adapt to changing circumstances. But the restored monarchies operated under fundamentally different conditions than their predecessors. Queens in the 19th century had to justify their existence through constitutional service rather than divine right. They were expected to embody national virtues, support charitable causes, and serve as symbols of stability and continuity rather than sources of political authority. The new model of queenship that emerged from this crisis was more limited, but also more secure than its predecessor. Constitutional monarchies provided clearer rules about royal authority while also protecting royal families from the violent overthrows that had characterized earlier periods. Queens could no longer rule directly, but they also faced less risk of execution or exile. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century also created new cultural appreciation for monarchy and queenship. Writers like Walter Scott and Alexandre Dumas romanticized medieval and early modern royal women, creating popular images of queens as heroic figures who embodied national identity and historical continuity. This romanticization had complex effects on contemporary royal women. On one hand, it provided new sources of legitimacy and popular support. On the other hand, it created unrealistic expectations that were difficult to fulfill in practice. Queens were expected to be simultaneously modern and traditional, accessible and magnificent, influential and deferential. The legacy of medieval and early modern queens extends far beyond the boundaries of royal history. These women established precedents for female political leadership that would influence the development of women's rights and gender equality for centuries to come. Their examples demonstrated that women could exercise effective authority in traditionally male domains, providing ammunition for later feminist movements. The administrative innovations pioneered by queens like Blanche of Castile and Catherine de Medici contributed to the development of modern bureaucratic government. Their emphasis on professional competence over personal loyalty helped establish principles of merit-based administration that remain central to contemporary political systems. The cultural patronage of Renaissance queens created artistic and intellectual achievements that shaped European civilization. Isabella d'Este's support for Renaissance artists, Catherine de Medici's influence on French architecture, and Elizabeth I's patronage of Elizabethan drama created cultural legacies that continue to influence contemporary art, literature, and thought. The diplomatic innovations of medieval queens also had lasting impact. Their use of marriage alliances, cultural exchanges, and personal relationships to manage international conflicts provided models for modern diplomatic practice. The concept of soft power, influence exercised through culture and personal relationships, rather than military force, has clear antecedents in the practices of medieval and Renaissance queens. Perhaps most significantly, the struggles of historical queens with the contradictions between traditional gender roles and political authority prefigured many of the challenges faced by contemporary female leaders. The need to balance feminine ideals with masculine responsibilities, to exercise authority while maintaining legitimacy, and to navigate between public expectations and personal desires remains central to women's political experience. The legal precedents established by queens regnant like Elizabeth I and Maria Theresa also influenced the development of women's legal rights. Their successful reigns demonstrated that women could handle the responsibilities of supreme authority, providing arguments for expanding women's legal and political equality in later periods. Today, we can see clear echoes of medieval queenship and contemporary female political leadership. Modern female heads of government face many of the same challenges that confronted queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de Medici. How to exercise authority in male-dominated systems, how to balance competing demands and loyalties, and how to maintain legitimacy while pursuing necessary but unpopular policies. The media scrutiny faced by contemporary female leaders parallels the gossip and scandal-mongering that surrounded historical queens. Marie Antoinette's struggle with negative publicity and character assassination bears striking similarities to the experiences of modern female politicians who find their personal lives, appearance, and family relationships subjected to intense public examination. The double bind that affects contemporary female leaders, being criticized for being too aggressive or too weak, too feminine or too masculine, has clear antecedents in the contradictory expectations placed on historical queens. Medieval queens who were too assertive risked being labeled as unnatural or threatening, while those who were too passive were dismissed as ineffective. Modern debates about work-life balance for female professionals echo the struggles of historical queens to balance their roles as wives and mothers with their political responsibilities. Queens like Isabella of Castile, who managed to be effective rulers while bearing and raising multiple children, faced challenges that remain relevant to contemporary women in leadership positions. The use of symbolic authority and cultural influence by modern female leaders also parallels the strategies developed by historical queens. Contemporary figures like Queen Elizabeth II of Britain or former Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany have demonstrated how women can exercise significant influence through institutional authority and cultural symbolism rather than direct political power. The international dimension of modern female leadership also reflects patterns established by historical queens. The networks of relationships that contemporary female leaders build across national boundaries, their use of cultural diplomacy and personal relationships to manage international conflicts, and their role as symbols of their nation's values all have precedence in the practices of medieval and Renaissance queens. Even now, the legacy of historical queens continues to influence contemporary politics and culture. Academic study of queenship has become a major field of historical research, contributing to our understanding of gender, power, and political authority. This scholarship has helped challenge traditional narratives of history that marginalized women's contributions to political development. Popular culture remains fascinated with historical queens, as evidenced by the success of television series like The Crown, Victoria, and The Spanish Princess. These productions shape public understanding of female leadership while also reflecting contemporary anxieties about gender, power, and political authority. Political discourse continues to reference historical queens as symbols and precedents. Female political candidates often invoke the examples of queens like Elizabeth I or Catherine the Great to legitimize their claims to authority, while critics sometimes use negative stereotypes about historical queens to undermine contemporary female leaders. The constitutional monarchies that survive in the modern world also preserve elements of traditional queenship, though in highly modified forms. Contemporary queens like Elizabeth II, Margaret II of Denmark, and Queen Maxima of the Netherlands demonstrate how the institution of queenship has adapted to democratic governance while maintaining symbolic and cultural functions. Women's rights movements worldwide continue to draw inspiration from the examples of historical queens who challenged gender restrictions and exercised effective authority. These historical precedents provide powerful counterarguments to claims that women are inherently unsuited for political leadership. The study of historical queenship also continues to influence contemporary feminist theory and gender studies. Scholars use the examples of historical queens to explore questions about the relationship between gender and power, the role of symbolic authority in political systems, and the ways that women can exercise influence within patriarchal structures. Looking back across more than a millennium of European queenship, we've witnessed one of history's most remarkable transformations. From the warrior queens of the early medieval period to the constitutional monarchs of the modern era, royal women have consistently adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their relevance and influence. The most surprising discovery in this journey has been the sheer diversity of models that queenship has encompassed. Medieval queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine exercised direct political authority that would have been unthinkable in later periods, while Renaissance queens like Elizabeth I created new forms of symbolic power that influenced political development for centuries. We've seen how personal relationships between queens and their contemporaries shaped international politics, how individual choices by royal women triggered wars and revolutions, and how the evolution of queenship reflected broader changes in European society, religion, and culture. The key patterns that emerge from this history are both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because they demonstrate that women have always found ways to exercise significant influence and authority, even within systems designed to exclude them. Sobering because they reveal how much resistance and hostility female leadership has historically encountered, and how precarious women's political authority has often been. Perhaps most importantly, this history shows that there is no single model of effective female leadership. Queens have succeeded through military prowess, diplomatic skill, cultural patronage, administrative competence, and personal charisma. They have exercised authority directly and indirectly, formally and informally, individually and collaboratively. The evolution of queenship also reveals the complex relationship between gender roles and political authority. Each era has created new expectations and constraints for royal women, reflecting broader social anxieties about female power and authority. Yet within these constraints, individual queens have consistently found ways to expand the boundaries of what was considered possible or acceptable for women. One final story encapsulates the complexity and continuing relevance of this history. In 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom in a ceremony that deliberately evoked medieval traditions while also acknowledging contemporary realities. The coronation combined ancient rituals of anointing and crowning with modern elements like television broadcasting and democratic representation. Elizabeth's subsequent reign has demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of modern queenship. As a constitutional monarch, she has wielded no direct political power, yet her influence on British politics and culture has been enormous. She has served as a symbol of stability and continuity through decades of social and political transformation, while also adapting the monarchy to changing public expectations and democratic governance. The Queen's approach to her role has clear precedence in the strategies developed by her historical predecessors. Like Elizabeth I, she has used her unmarried status in her case, her long marriage to Prince Philip, as a source of legitimacy and stability. Like medieval queens, she has relied on personal relationships and cultural symbolism to maintain her authority. Like Renaissance queens, she has served as a patron of arts and culture, while carefully avoiding direct involvement in political controversies. But Elizabeth II has also faced challenges that earlier queens never encountered. The rise of mass media, democratic politics, and celebrity culture has created new pressures and expectations for royal behavior. The Queen has had to balance traditional monarchical dignity with modern demands for accessibility, and transparency. The ongoing evolution of the British monarchy under Elizabeth II illustrates how the institution of queenship continues to adapt to contemporary circumstances while maintaining connections to its historical roots. Recent changes to succession laws that eliminate male primogeniture reflect broader social changes regarding gender equality, while the monarchy's emphasis on charitable work and public service echoes the patronage traditions established by medieval and Renaissance queens. The Queen's reign has also highlighted the international dimensions of modern queenship. As head of the Commonwealth, Elizabeth II has maintained relationships with dozens of former British colonies, serving as a symbol of shared history and continuing cooperation. This role parallels the diplomatic functions performed by historical queens who used marriage alliances and cultural exchanges to manage international relationships. Perhaps most significantly, Elizabeth II's long reign has demonstrated the continuing relevance of symbolic authority in democratic societies. Even without direct political power, her role as a constitutional monarch has provided stability and continuity that purely elected leaders cannot offer. This suggests that some elements of traditional queenship remain valuable even in contemporary democratic contexts. The story of European queenship is ultimately a story about the persistent human desire for effective leadership and the complex ways that gender, power, and authority intersect in political systems. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to Elizabeth II, royal women have demonstrated that leadership takes many forms and that effective authority can be exercised through multiple channels. These queens were neither saints nor demons, but complex individuals who responded to the challenges and opportunities of their times with varying degrees of success. Their stories remind us that history is shaped not just by abstract forces and institutional changes, but by the choices of individual people operating within specific circumstances and constraints. As we reflect on their legacy, we can appreciate both their achievements and their limitations. They expanded possibilities for female leadership while also working within systems that restricted women's opportunities. They exercised real authority, while also serving symbolic functions that reinforced existing power structures. Their lives and reigns continue to offer insights into the ongoing challenges of leadership, the evolution of political institutions, and the complex relationship between personal agency and historical change. In their triumphs and failures, their innovations and traditions, we can see reflections of our own continuing struggles to create more just and effective forms of governance. And perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to these remarkable women. Not to idealize them, but to learn from their examples as we continue to work toward political systems that can harness the talents and energies of all their citizens, regardless of gender, birth, or circumstance. The crown may have passed through many hands, but the search for wise and effective leadership continues. Let's talk about Joan of Navarre, who became Queen of England in 1403 and managed to become the only English queen ever formally tried for witchcraft. This wasn't some village-wise woman accused by superstitious peasants. This was the stepmother of Henry V, one of England's most successful kings, accused of trying to murder him through black magic. Joan's troubles began in 1419, when Henry V's government was desperately short of money to fund the ongoing war in France. Someone in the royal council noticed that Joan's dower lands were worth about £6,000 per year, a massive sum that could fund several military campaigns. All they needed was a pretext to confiscate her property. The solution was brilliant in its cynicism. Joan was accused of practicing sorcery against the king's life, specifically of creating wax images of Henry V and melting them slowly to cause his death. The charges were obviously fabricated. Henry was in perfect health and winning battles in France, but witchcraft accusations were nearly impossible to disprove, especially when the accuser controlled the courts. What made Joan's case, particularly outrageous, was the evidence presented against her. Witnesses testified that they had seen her consulting with demons, performing midnight rituals, and brewing potions designed to weaken the king's will. The testimony was so theatrical that it reads like a medieval fantasy novel rather than a legal proceeding. But Joan wasn't a helpless victim. She had spent years building relationships with English nobles and understood how royal politics worked. From her prison in Pevensey Castle, she maintained correspondence with supporters and gradually built a case for her innocence. Her letters from this period show a woman who was angry, defiant, and politically sophisticated. The most damning evidence against the government's case was Henry V's continued military success. If Joan's magic was supposed to be weakening him, it was spectacularly ineffective. Henry conquered most of northern France and forced the French king to recognize him as heir to the French throne. When Henry V died suddenly in 1422, probably from dysentery, Joan's supporters pointed out that his death proved her innocence. If she had been trying to kill him through sorcery, why would she wait 3 years to succeed? The new king, Henry VI, was only 9 months old and needed all the political stability he could get. Joan was quietly released in 1422, and her lands were restored. She lived comfortably for another 15 years, but the witchcraft trial had permanently damaged her reputation. Her case became a precedent for how royal women could be neutralized through religious accusations when political methods proved insufficient. Long before Elizabeth Bathory allegedly bathed in virgin blood, there was Constance of Antioch, whose reign in the 12th century established the template for royal women who used their authority to satisfy sadistic impulses. Constance ruled the Principality of Antioch from 1130 to 1163, and her court became notorious for entertainments that crossed the line from decadent to homicidal. Constance inherited Antioch at age 9 when her father Bohemond II was killed fighting Muslim forces. As a crusader state surrounded by hostile territory, Antioch required strong military leadership. What it got instead was a woman who seemed more interested in psychological experiments than political governance. The first signs of trouble emerged when Constance reached adulthood and began personally supervising the interrogation of captured Muslim soldiers. Contemporary accounts describe sessions that lasted for days, with Constance asking increasingly bizarre questions about Islamic religious practices while various forms of torture were applied. But Constance's interests weren't limited to enemy soldiers. She also began experimenting on her own subjects, particularly women accused of adultery or witchcraft. Under the guise of investigating moral crimes, she developed elaborate punishment rituals that seemed designed more for her entertainment than for justice. The most disturbing reports concern Constance's treatment of her own servants. Multiple sources describe instances where palace staff simply disappeared, with their families told they had been sent on secret missions or transferred to other crusader states. Archaeological excavations of Antioch in the 20th century uncovered mass graves near the palace containing dozens of skeletons, showing signs of systematic torture. Constance's behavior became so notorious that it threatened Antioch's relationships with other crusader states. When she married Reynold of Chatillon in 1153, many hoped he would restrain her excesses. Instead, Reynold seemed to encourage them, and the couple's joint reign became even more brutal than Constance's solo rule. The Byzantine emperor, Manuel I Comnenus, finally intervened in 1159, using military pressure to force Constance into exile. She died in 1163, probably from poison administered by her own household staff, who had finally had enough of her reign of terror. Constance's legacy was carefully suppressed by later Crusader historians who wanted to maintain the image of the Crusades as a holy war. But her example influenced how later medieval rulers thought about the acceptable limits of royal authority and the dangers of giving absolute power to individuals with sadistic tendencies. Byzantine Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita, who lived from 978 to 1050, managed to turn the imperial palace into what medieval chroniclers delicately called a den of Venus, but what we would recognize as history's most expensive brothel. Zoe was married 3 times, had dozens of documented lovers, and allegedly maintained a harem of young men whose only job was to satisfy her sexual appetites. Zoe's first marriage to Romanos III was purely political, but she quickly made it clear that political necessity wouldn't constrain her personal desires. She began affairs with palace guards, court officials, and visiting diplomats while Romanos was still alive. When Romanos died suddenly in 1034, possibly from poisoning, Zoe immediately married her favorite lover, Michael IV, but Michael's reign was marked by illness and political instability, partly because Zoe continued her affairs throughout their marriage. She reportedly told courtiers that monogamy was a barbarian custom, unsuitable for an empress who represented the glory of Rome. When Michael IV died in 1041, Zoe married his nephew Michael V, who promptly tried to exile her to a monastery. Bad move. Zoe had spent decades building relationships with palace guards, army officers, and court officials, many of whom had been her lovers. When she called for support, half the imperial army responded. Michael V was overthrown, blinded, and castrated, the traditional Byzantine punishment for usurpers. Zoe resumed her position as empress and continued her sexual adventures well into her 60s, scandalizing even the famously decadent Byzantine court. Her third marriage to Constantine IX in 1042 was supposed to provide stability, but Zoe insisted on maintaining her independence. She kept separate apartments, continued her affairs, and reportedly maintained detailed records of her sexual encounters as a form of political intelligence gathering. Zoe's legacy influenced Byzantine court culture for generations, establishing the precedent that imperial women could exercise sexual freedom as a form of political power.